and they're all from people's home
Closets.
offices. So it's fun
Yeah.
to see what they've got going on. So
Yeah, this is I hope you don't see too much of it because it really looks like the kind of place where I'll die and be eaten by cats. At home. Yeah, for me, it's been really similar. I mean, like it hasn't been that different. Like I'm keeping my work schedule. I'm on deadline for a book. Um, I'm trying to put together a bunch of alternate events after the book tour got canceled or postponed, I guess. So I've been actually busier than I normally am. Um, so it's a very it's just, I come into my office which has no windows, as you can see, and I don't even realize what's in the outside world until I leave at night and see how empty everything is.
right. And you're basically like on a one. You've got like a book every year now. You're on one of those schedules.
Yeah, last year there were some scheduling difficulties because my editor left Quirk, so it was like a book in 2 years, which was good. Southern Book Club's kind of a long book, and so I was glad to have a little extra time for it. But yeah, I got a book coming out next year and a book coming out the year after, and actually two books maybe coming out next year. So I have I think my level of productivity is set at cocaine, basically.
Are it all of them fiction, or are you doing anything like Paperbacks from Hell?
I'm actually doing nonfiction right now. I'm doing a
Okay.
book. We don't have a title yet, but it's Paperbacks from Hell for Kung Fu movies coming to America in the 70s. I'm working with a co-author who has this huge collection, and it's just sort of this crazy, it's all these like movies that came to the States and all the distributors and the lawsuits and the murders and the just the general mayhem that ensued. And it's going to be really art heavy. The Alamo Drafthouse guys are putting it out, so it's going to be for sale in all their theaters. But it's nonfiction. I always forget how intense it is because everything has to be true, which means a lot of research on every single page. I've been working on chapter 3 for a month and a half now. So eventually, either I will finish chapter 3 or I'll kill myself.
Um, is each chapter one film, or is it?
No, each chapter is sort of a chunk of time. So
Okay.
chapter 2 is 1973. Chapter 3 is sort of the 74 to about 79, when everything just sort of went to hell and nunchucks got made illegal and all these Bruce exploitation, Bruce Lee ripoff movies came out, and all this craziness. So a lot of mafia stuff, and it's just wild.
Yeah, I don't think I know much of that history because I have like a
Well,
little
it's
bit of a
all,
film background, but it's not really in that
yeah. Well, the
era.
distribution's all crazy. It was all these guys basically working out of these offices in Times Square, and there'd be mob distributors and rip-off distributors and porn distributors, and I mean, it was just this wild, wild world. I mean, one of the movies we did in the second chapter was put out by this guy from Atlanta named Michael Thivas, who was then when the movie was released in the US, this Hong Kong kung fu movie, he dubbed into English and got a local band named Flood to do the soundtrack for. The same week it was released, he was actually a porn baron who ran peep shows all over the country. And he actually, the same week the movie was released, murdered his former business partner with a car bomb. And then when the band actually got a real bump of interest from the movie because people really liked the soundtrack, and they were going to Jamaica to record a single at Bob Marley's studio down there, and they got pulled off the plane by the FBI because their boss had been arrested for all these murders, and wound up spending the rest of his life in prison. Although he did manage to parlay a bunch of campaign contributions to Jimmy Carter into getting moved to a lower security prison in 78. And then it was so low security, he one day just walked out of the visitor room and was missing for 10 months, during which time he shotgun murdered one of the people who was going to be a witness for the state in his upcoming trial, and then he got caught trying to cash a $31,000 check, I think, at a supermarket. So it's like, it's all these sort of crazy marginal personalities.
I love the fact that you're talking about how everything has to be true, but since you're writing nonfiction, but I don't know anyone that could make all of that up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's look at what's going on right now, right? I mean, there's so many fictional versions of the apocalypse in movies and TV, and they're always like crazy and all this stuff's going on, and people are like, give me that can of beans, I'm gonna shoot you for that chili, and
Right.
all this stuff. And this has all been just really quiet, like it's just really unexpected. A friend of mine, Paul Tremblay, has a book coming out in July called Survivor Song that's about a outbreak of a virus, a rabies kind of virus that spreads through New England. And I was reading the arc, and it's eerily on the nose, and the places where it's different feel so strange because now we know what happens.
Right.
But it's all about N95 masks and people setting up these tent cleaning stations outside hospitals. And I mean, it's really bonkers. I can't tell if it's going to do really, really well, or no one's going to want to read that. But it's interesting. There's been a huge number of sort of, when I did Paperbacks from Hell and read all those paperback horror novels from the 70s and 80s, there are all these apocalypse books, and a lot of them are viral or about bacterial infections or plagues. And they're all really different, I mean, in a lot of ways, but also the weird message of so many of them is like life just goes back to normal afterwards, usually. I mean, that's Stephen King's The Stand, everything just goes back to normal. Or there were a bunch of like this little puppy, Rabies, by David Ann, who later would write a book about killer rabbits infesting England. But rabies was one of these, or rabid was one of these, like, when England joined the European Common Market in the 70s, they had all these books about rabies infections, mostly coming from France, because France was where everyone was dirty. And at the end of them, everything just goes back to normal, and people feel really bashful about having murdered their rabid neighbors and things. So, I think the takeaway from that is don't do anything extreme, because you'll just feel embarrassed about it later.
I mean, I hope so. You're right about how normal everything, not normal, how boring everything has been.
Yeah.
At least for us. Like, I'm sure there's people that this has been very stressful, and their
Oh, yeah.
lives are completely different than what we're going through. But I do like how quiet it's been. I'm hoping it stays that way. So
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's such a discrepancy in people in healthcare and people not. And, I mean, everyone's just supposed to stay chill and relax and not get worked up or hoard toilet paper. But if you're in healthcare, obviously, it's a whole different kettle of fish. Or, if you're in education, one of the things I found really amazing is all these teachers trying to keep classes going at home and trying to keep their students engaged and all this stuff. And it's interesting that some of the lowest paid professions, like teaching or being a nurse, or an emergency room tech, or being a scientist in a lot of cases, happen to be the most vital right now. Like, no one really cares about venture capitalists right this minute.
right.
No one wants to hear about your killer app that's going to disrupt pizza delivery.
But yet the pizza delivery people are still out there delivering pizzas.
Yeah, they're the real heroes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Almost the only thing on the streets of New York right now are delivery guys. Still on their bikes, still chugging around. But I've noticed fewer and fewer as this goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like more and more people are sort of like cooking at home. My wife's a chef who owns a couple of restaurants, and she had to close both of them and let everyone go. And it's the first time she's done the dishes in our house in like 7 years, 8 years. She made up the bed yesterday. I was like, what is this craziness? Who are you? So it's been really weird to see the readjustment.
So you're talking about reading and researching your new book that you're working on now. How are you researching that stuff?
Yeah, I'm writing with this guy, Chris Bajali, who's an amazing researcher. And so basically, as he tries to sort of stay ahead of where I am in the book, and gives me just these massive packages of information from like old martial arts magazines from the 70s and old issues of Variety and local newspapers and all this craziness. And um, so a lot of it's internet research. He's also a librarian, so a lot of it's research he does on microfilm. But yeah, that's really what it is, and it's just the craziest stuff. I mean, it's interesting to see how people used to talk in interviews in the 70s and the 80s before they got really media savvy. Like people would really say mean things about their business partners in print in 1976 that they probably wouldn't in 1996, you know? So it's been really interesting to see a lot of how uncensored some of this is. And, you know, it's been interesting to see, it's almost sweet how naive people are about letting people look at their lives like, ah, come on into my home, this is my girlfriend. And you know, it's some like 70-year-old screenwriter dating a 22-year-old, you know, and you're like, I'm drawing conclusions you don't want me to draw here. So yeah, it's been really amazing to get a lot of these sort of original-ish documents. um, you know, and that's been one of the things that's been really interesting with this, is seeing how wrong the internet is about so much stuff, and how you often have to go back to original newspapers or magazines. Or really, one thing Chris does is like, he goes back to the original ads that ran in newspapers to see where a movie was playing and how it was playing and who it was being sold to and what theaters it was in, because he sort of has a good idea of which theaters were sort of the grittier ones and which were the high class ones, and which were, you know, with these movies, there came a moment where all the distributors were like, most of our audience seems to be Black and Hispanic and pretty low income, so we're just going to sell them any kind of garbage. We don't care about the quality of the movies we pick up anymore. And you know, you'll get these interviews with these distributors saying things like, we're hoping to release thoughtful movies that really show the beauty of martial arts, and they're releasing stuff, you know, like One Punch Killer with a guy holding a pair of like bloody eyeballs in his fist, you know, to some like drive-in in like the middle of like hillbilly Alabama. So, you know, you get what they say they think of their audience, and then what they actually think of their audience.
And then for paperbacks, from how you did you read all of the books?
Oh
That
God, yeah. I mean, I used to review books and movies for a couple of newspapers and things a long time ago. And I made a vow to myself that I would never write about something I hadn't read all of or seen all of, because I got in trouble that way. And so yeah, I read all of them. I mean, these are, you can see behind me boxes and boxes of
Jeez.
like paperbacks just taking up my entire life, shelves and all this stuff. And it's just like, I just, creepily enough, I just keep buying them and buying them and buying them. And it's just endless. And eventually I will die crushed beneath a mountain of them. It also becomes sort of habitual after a while. And like you see this weird part of the world you didn't know about before. And all these books, like so many of them are out of print. Like, and you know, Christina Crawford, Joan Crawford's daughter, she wrote some horror paperbacks in the 80s. Um, uh, uh, One of the Watergate co-conspirators, E. Howard Hunt, wrote some paperback horror novels in the 70s, and he was actually advertised them on the cover. It says convicted Watergate co-conspirator E. Howard Hunt with Coven. And so it's amazing. It's just this little weird part of the world, you know. And one of those books, it's also so much fun to see sort of like how things work. Like this book, Bugs, which is a plague book, but someone must have gotten confused about bugs and bugs. So it's about computer bugs that are actually bugs that come out of the computer and eat children. It's really, really ridiculous and much more boring than it sounds. Um,
I love that
but
it
yeah,
has
so
like a
it's,
tagline to it, because you don't,
oh, yeah. Well, first the Andromeda Strain, now bugs.
because I don't feel like I see that anymore, like
Yeah.
where they're pitching
Well,
it like a
it's,
movie.
yeah, well, it's like, you know, it's like you gotta, I mean, this was the ad for the book, right? You had basically 4 by 6 or 7 inches to pull people in. And so, you had, hold on, you had people like Jim Plumieri at New American Library, who was the art director over there, who saw Stephen King come in, who was selling all these numbers, and Doubleday, I think, was King's original publisher, and they had nothing but contempt for him, and they published him in hardcover. And these guys did the paperbacks, and Plumieri was like, "No, we're going to do our own paperbacks." He's like, "And I want really stylish, really sleek covers that are really minimal and really classy." So you get things like the cover for Salem's Lot, which is literally just black. You can kind of see an embossed girl's face in there, but there is no author name, there is no title, there is nothing. And so what happened is every bookstore employee who got it wound up shelving it in reverse so people could see the title. And so they had to pull those and rapidly reissue them with the actual cover title on the author's name on the cover. So I mean, everyone was trying to, because his idea was, if I can intrigue people, what is this all black cover? They pick it up, and giving them to pick it up off the shelf is the first step in selling a book. But really it just confused people.
I've never seen that cover before.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? But it's the movie poster principle, like you said. It's like, what do we do to pull people in? And it's such a far cry from book covers now, which, really try to be something classy that you won't be embarrassed to have on your coffee table. And it turns out usually that's a girl with her back to the camera walking away from the reader. In a weird number of books. Like 2 years ago, that seemed to be the theme on all these covers.
It's still the theme. They're still coming out. It's self-help books with swear words that are
asterisked out.
Yeah. I saw one that was the word heck, and they had asterisked out the E, and I was really confused, like if they're just trying, like they were just using the asterisks, but they didn't want anybody to actually think there's gonna be dirty words in the book. So
well, it's also funny because like this whole idea of literature and things being classy and highbrow, like we feel like it's a British thing, but with paperbacks, like the British covers were the grossest. Like they were the most raw. And I was just looking at this before we were talking, but The Fog, the James Herbert book, which is just a severed head. And also James Herbert commits the cardinal sin of interior decorating, combining gold foil with silver foil. You never want gold and silver. It always looks cheap, Jim. But, it resulted in some books, like one of my favorite covers for Crabs, The Human Sacrifice, which is a crab about to kill someone with a knife. And you're kind of like, crab, you don't need a knife. You've got your mighty claws. But somehow it's internalized its oppressor's ways. But yeah, so this, British covers were sort of the goriest and the grossest, which really goes against this merchant ivory idea of England people like me have.
When you were reading all of these books, were you, like, I assume like you enjoy reading some of it, I would hope.
Oh yeah.
Is there any of it that like you were surprised with, like it being literature? Is there anything you're like, this is like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've actually been working with this press called Valancourt to reissue a lot of these. But there's books like Joan Sampson's The Auctioneer, which is this amazing it's kind of like Stephen King's Needful Things if Cormac McCarthy had written it in the 70s. And it was a big hit in the day, but unfortunately Joan died of brain cancer a few months after it came out. But we reissued that. There's an author, Barry Wood, who wrote this fantastic book called The Tribe that's sort of the pivotal work of Jewish horror. But it's about a golem in Manhattan in the 80s, and this group of Holocaust survivors. And it's just this big, thick, dense book you just lose yourself in. And if, like me, you have any nostalgia for sort of like that gritty New York of the 70s and 80s, like and those sort of sprawling novels that really, they seem to be in shorter and shorter supplies. I feel like people write more and more memoir and more stuff that's very internal. And this is one of those things with multiple characters taking place over many, many timelines. I mean, it's popular fiction. but it's really well written and a really beautiful book, and just really smart and touching. There's a guy, Ken Greenhall, who just bombed out his entire career. I mean, every book he published came from a worse publisher and had a trashier cover. He wrote like 7 books, and he had a day job as an encyclopedia editor all his life. But his books, he wrote a book called Elizabeth, one called Hellhound, it's told from the point of view of a dog that just none of its owners live up to what it feels like their standards should be, and it keeps killing them. But his books are really amazing. I mean, like the kind of things that, like, if Shirley Jackson has sort of an air, Ken Greenhall has this really chilly, really precise diction that really captures the way she wrote. You know, one of the other things that really blew my mind is, so with Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, it's partially about a book club that reads true crime. And when I had that idea, I'd already written a version of the book where they don't read true. It was just a regular book club. And something was missing. I realized, oh, they should read true crime, because it's set in the 90s, and that was when that was really big. And I realized I would have to read a bunch of true crime in order to sort of like pick out their books and all that. And I got to say, I have had a really snobby point of view towards true crime books. I mean, you know, all those mass market paperbacks with those gritty, grimy 8 pages of photos, and there's some stuff in there that's just really phenomenal. I mean, you know, everyone talks about Truman Capote and In Cold Blood, but Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me is a fantastic book, and really sort of launched the genre when she wrote it in 1980. I don't know if you know it, but it's basically, she was at the time a single mom with 4 kids trying to make ends meet as a freelance writer for all these true detective magazines. And she got her first book deal for like $10,000 to write about these co-ed murders in the Northwest. And they wound up being the Ted Bundy killings. And Ted Bundy happened to be her good friend who worked next door at a suicide hotline. And so the book is this really queasy mix of autobiography and this clinical look at these, or this very forensic look at these murders, and her sort of navigating this gradually unfolding revelation that this really good friend of hers has been murdering all these women. It's an amazing book. So, you know, one thing I'm always happy for is, you know, for every garbage book I read, well, I'll revise that ratio. For every 7 or 8 garbage books I read, I come across something that I'd feel a lot poorer if I hadn't read. So I can live with that. I'm a fast reader.
Yeah, I think I get a similar thing out of book selling. Because you also, like, you program films and
yeah,
do a lot of that, which I did for like a little bit on a small scale, like years ago. And I have a friend who always, one time, I always tell this story, and I always feel like it was really, really accurate. He called me an appreciator, which I always like thought was like
right.
very, just like, I don't know. The more I've thought about it over the years, like the more generous I felt that is, and more pride I've taken into it. But I've always like just enjoyed finding a book that maybe isn't getting any sort of attention, or that people have overlooked, that I really care about, and get the opportunity to like put it out in the world.
Yeah.
And put it into people's hands.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Like with Paperbacks from Hell, the most gratifying thing to me, and I don't mean to sound like Pollyanna, is watching these authors come back into print and seeing people get excited about them. But also the artists, some of the cover artists that really worked with us on the book, like their paintings have gone up in value. People are buying them more. And
right.
It's been really, really nice to see this sort of niche be rediscovered and reappreciated, because there's some amazing stuff in there. You know, one thing that was really fascinating to me, because I'm a big Stephen King fan, but was to realize that Stephen King was sort of writing late, like Carrie, which is sort of like, to some extent, a teenage book, sort of came out at the tail end of all these teenage books. The Shining came out late for a huge boom in haunted house books. Cujo came out at the end of a big boom in killer dog books. Like it was weird. He just sort of like seemed to absorb it all and then filter it through his own thing, his own sensibility. So it was neat to put those pieces together. But really, it's really, really nice, like you said, to watch someone else respond to something you love that you help them find. It always makes me, I don't know, you know, an author's only as good as their readers, right? And when they're out of readers, they're dead. Whether they're still respirating or not, no more readers, you're done. And so it's nice to see some of these folks sort of coming back from the grave.
Yeah, I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So one of the things we were going to talk about, and I think my guess is you have a stack of them next to you, are some books on pandemics and these
Yeah.
sorts of things. They're
Well, yeah,
within that genre.
yeah. Well, it's interesting. Some of these are garbage. But you know, in the one I was looking for that's actually kind of fun, I couldn't find in my boxes. But this book called the Lissa Syndrome, about an outbreak of rabies in Maine, that's very low key, and it's actually interesting because it's mostly about the logistics of trying to contain a spreading pandemic. And it's a lot about tents and a lot about supplies and a lot about roadblocks. But there's a weird thing in it where more people seem to die of self-inflicted gunshot wounds than actually die of rabies. Um, but yeah, so you know, there was a big boom in the 70s of sort of rabies literature in the UK, like Rabid, and there were other books like Saliva, and I think Saliva was one, Bats was one, and there was another book though that let's see, I'm trying to think. Oh, yeah, there was this. I just wanted to do a quick shout out to the cats, which is not a disease book at all, but was another British animal attack book by a guy, Nick Sharman, who I've become friends with since then. His real name's Scott Gronmark, who's a really lovely guy. But this book makes the cardinal sin of trying to scare you about a world overrun by kitty cats. And at the end of the day, cats are just too cute to get scared of. And when you sit in this book and you start reading about these encounters, or these meetings that like the army's having about, you know, well, first we'll drive the cats into the town square with machine gun fire. Well, we'll douse them with napalm. You really are on the side of the cats. You're like, that's terrible. There were also some really weird American books, plague books. One that I just started reading by Arthur Herzog, which you can see this lovely gold foil here, IQ 83. Arthur Herzog had recently written a killer bee book called The Swarm that became a movie with Michael Caine. This is a book where everyone's IQ, because of a viral pandemic, drops to 83. And you can tell that like Arthur Herzog probably belonged to Mensa, because he's like, an IQ of 83, clearly you are too stupid to live. You'll never be able to do Sudoku. I just started to read it, and it seems to have a real problem with women, because it seems to be suggesting that their IQs stay about the same because they were 83 in the first place. So not too inspirational. Spore 7, which is about a outbreak of sort of, it's a bacteria that's been napping beneath the Earth's surface, but then breaks out and people become covered in slime and begin to bite other people. So it's a bit of a bitey book, which is its own sort of subgenre. Masses of people biting each other. And it only gets solved when they nuke Mendocino, California. So let's hope it doesn't get that far. There was another book that, oh, yeah, I want to just give a brief shout out again to The Fog, which is basically a killer fart kind of erupts from underground, and this toxic cloud begins to roll across the countryside. And what it does is it makes everyone very bitey and violent. And it lits James Herbert, the author, who was sort of the punk rock king of British gore novels in the mid to late 70s, or actually it lets him settle scores with all the people he hates, in particular gym teachers. Like, gym teachers get it coming and going in this book. Their students murder them, their students castrate them, their students drown them. It's really that open season on gym students. But it turns out why this is included, I'm including it in the pandemic roundup, is actually the killer fart is a mycoplasma. It's a kind of bacteria which has grown to enormous size, and it can only be stopped when the hero tracks down this giant bacteria in the heart of London and punches it to death. So, you know, that happened. One of my favorite books, and I have a terrible library copy of it, but one of my favorite books as a kid was this book called The Girl Who Owned a City. And it's basically about a virus that wipes out everyone over 12 years old. And the world gets rebuilt by children, including 11-year-old Lisa. She may actually be 10, who winds up leading this giant child army that like pours boiling oil on their enemies and builds castles and things. And the thing that's fascinating about this book is, as a kid, I couldn't get enough of it because I wanted to read about a world with no adults. As an adult, what I've learned is that the author of this book, O.T. Nelson, was a successful businessman or woman, I'm not quite sure which, but who was a real devotee of Ayn Rand. And the book was their attempt to put Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy into a form that children could consume and understand that sharing was bad and letting other people have things was the worst thing you could possibly do. And then there are two other books I just want to mention briefly. One is Graham Masterton, who was absolutely the master of B-movie mayhem in book form. Most famous for his Native American curse novel, The Manitou, which is really fabulous. Wrote a book, Condor, about hyperpolio. And it posits that a Nazi scientist who developed a way to spread rabies by missile was in league with the Kennedy family to basically blackmail the United States and make FDR surrender to the Nazis at the end of World War II to avoid a hyperpolio outbreak. But it all got mixed up and the hyperpolio-bearing plane crashed, and now it's coming loose again as one of the Kennedy ancestors runs for president on a weak-willed liberal platform, which Masterton takes great pleasure in dismantling.
It's not about a giant bird.
No, I know, right? Literally, there is not a single giant bird about to eat the Capitol building in this book. It's very disappointing. And I think that's a sign of how jaded these books have made me, that I don't even notice that this book has a giant condor on the cover about to eat the Capitol, but like, and doesn't deliver on that. Like, I'm like, of course it does. Nothing ever happens on these covers that happens in the book. One of the classics that still holds up today, The Andromeda Strain. And, you know, it's Michael Crichton's book that made him a star, about a microorganism that causes people's blood to clot instantaneously. And I have to say, it's one of these books that is literally nothing more than people working in a lab really, really hard. And it manages to make that exciting. If you want to read about scientists and research scientists and have it feel like pornography, this is your ticket. Like, if you want to feel like hot under the collar about what like people in protective gear are doing at the CDC, this is the book that makes that sexy. But I also, you know, would like to say one last thing, which is that, you know, sometimes disease is the friend. In the Crabs books, which was a series of books by Guy N. Smith about killer giant crabs rampaging through England, they shrug off shells from tanks. They laugh at bullets from our guns. But the one thing that defeats crabs is cancer, punnily enough. And actually, the hero of this book is a marine biologist who discovers that a certain kind of British weed killer called paraquat is such a carcinogen that when the crabs are exposed to it, they all get cancer and die. So science wins. You know, there's this theme of mad scientists unleashing terrible things in books, but I find in these books, it's usually the scientists doing the good stuff that kills armies of 10-foot-tall rampaging man-eating crabs.
I think, like, in some ways, we would all be a little more at ease if there were giant crabs running around, because we could actually like focus on them as a problem instead of...
And one of the things that's made me realize that in New York is if giant crabs were attacking us, it would be quieter than I ever assumed, right? It would be like there's a couple of giant crabs down at South Street Seaport. So, you know, don't go below 14th Street, and that takeout pizza place you really like is going to be closed until tomorrow. Like, it would be quieter.
Right. But instead, we're just kind of hanging out. So.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's all I have for today.
Okay.
I really want to thank you for doing this and taking time to chat with us.
It's really nice to see another human face in the middle of my workday.
Yeah.
Usually I'm just sitting here looking at pictures of killer cats and garbage like that.
Well, we're always here, so you can just. I've been noticing people like we've been getting some people that will call the store and just want to chat a little bit
Yeah,
because
it it's human contact, man. It's kind of important.
yeah,